Welcome back. I'm going to carry on with The Hobbit. And Bilbo had just woken up to find out that the dwarves had all left. And they'd left him a note saying that he was now contracted to be their official burglar. And Gandalf was hurrying him out of the house without a handkerchief, without money, without anything. And he's on his way to catch up with the dwarves. So welcome back. Today's Tuesday, which is when I'm reading it. So I'll carry on. If you have any comments, put them down below, because I want to know if the way I'm reading it is working for you or not. Is it too fast, too slow? Should I make the video shorter, longer? Maybe not. And if you're enjoying it, or if there's anything I can improve, okay? So let's carry on. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater, just on the stroke of 11, and found that he'd come without a pocket handkerchief. "Bravo," said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently, for Bilbo. "Up you two get, and off we go," said Thorin. "I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I've come without my hat, and I've left my pocket handkerchief behind. And I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note till 10:45 to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry, you'll have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs." I'm sure you guys all manage without pocket handkerchiefs. We don't use them anymore, do we? "And a good many other things before you get to your journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and a cloak in my luggage." That's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning, just before May, this time of year, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. There he is, on his travels. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo might have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. You might have noticed I've shaved mine off, Bit thinner, They had not been riding very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. He'd bought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that, the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except of course when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked, but still he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they'd passed through Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country inhabited by decent folk with good roads, an inn or two. An inn is a pub. That's where people would stay overnight as they're travelling. And now and then a dwarf or a farmer walking slowly, ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they'd not gone far into the lone lands where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they'd been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they'd been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. "To think it will soon be June," grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time. It was pouring with rain, and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, the pony was tired and stumbled on stones, and the others were too grumpy to talk. "And I'm sure the rain has got into the dry clothes and into the food bags," thought Bilbo. "Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hall by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing." It was not the last time that he wished that. Still the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down into a deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up, and willows along its bank bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with the rains, came rushing down from the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper and where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on. Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he'd come all the way with them, never saying if he was in an adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He'd eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he simply was not there at all. Just when a wizard would have been most useful too, groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbits' views about regular meals, plenty, and often. They decided in the end that they'd have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip, drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have got into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire out of almost anything, almost anywhere, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright at nothing and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Fili and Kili were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off him. Of course, it was mostly the food, and there was mighty little left for supper, and even less for breakfast. There they all sat glum and wet and muttering while Oin and Gloin went on trying to light the fire and quarrelling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures were not all pony rides in mid-May sunshine when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." Out of the dark mass of the trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they'd looked at it for some while, they began to argue. Some said no, some said yes. Some said they could go but see, and anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all night. Others said, "These parts are none too well known and are too near the mountains. Travellers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use, things have changed for the worse, and the road is left unguarded. They've seldom even heard of the king round here, and the less inquisitive you are that means asking questions, less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find." Some said, "Oh, after all, there's 14 of us." Others said, "Where's Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. That settled it. "After all, we've got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could, they made a deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and ratting as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. If you've ever tried to go through trees in the pitch dark, you end up scratched and cut and bruised. Suddenly, the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks. Not far away, a little picture there, can you see it? A little tiny picture of the light shining through the trees. "Now it's the burglar's turn," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go and find out all about that light and what it's for, and if it's perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the hobbit. "Now scuttle off and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we'll do what we can." Can you hoot like a barn owl and screech like a screech owl? Off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he couldn't even hoot once like any kind of owl any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. You know what a weasel is? You know those little tiny, they are like a little tiny otter. They're kind of a light brown in colour. And they've got a relative called a stoat. Stoats and weasels are very similar, so I think the stoat is a bit smaller. But you know how you tell the difference between a weasel and a stoat? One's weaselly recognised and the other one is stoatily different. It's got nothing to do with the story. And this is what he saw when he got to the fire. 3 very large persons sitting around a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton, that means sheep, on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink on hand. And they were drinking out of jugs, but they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that from the great heavy faces of them and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it doesn't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls. Here's the trolls. You see them? It's a bit like you guys in the gym at lunchtime, sitting around in circles, complaining about your food. "Never a blinking bit of man flesh we've had for long enough," said a second. "What the hell William was a-thinking to bring us into these parts at all beats me, and the drink running short what's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be ate by you and Bert. You've ate a village and a half between you since we came down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up out our way. When you'd have said thank you, Bill, for a nice bit of valley mutton like what this is." He took a big bite of a sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. "Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like this, even those with only one head each." After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try a roasted dwarf, or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a good quick bit of burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the trolls' pockets. It's nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. A really worthwhile burglar would have pinched the mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their even noticing him. Others, more practical but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they even noticed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He'd read a good many things he'd never seen or done. He was very much alarmed as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he couldn't go back straight to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various how do you say this word? Burglarious proceedings he'd heard of, picking the troll's pocket seemed the least difficult. So at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel of beer. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand into William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it as big as a bag to Bilbo. "Ha!" thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. "This is a beginning." It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. "Here, who are you?" it squeaked as it left his pocket. And William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. "Blimey, Bert, look what I've copped," said William. "What is it?" said the others, coming up. "Lummy if I knows, where are you?" "Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit," said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. He's not in a very good position there, is he? Being held up by the toes by a big troll. A burrow hobbit, they said, a bit startled. Trolls are slow on the uptake and mighty suspicious of anything new to them. What's a burrow hobbit got to do with my pocket anyways, said William. And can you cook it, said Tom. You can try, said Bert, picking up a skewer. You wouldn't make more than a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper. Not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps there are more like him around, and we might make a pie, said Bert. You, are there any more of your sort sneaking in these here woods? You nasty little rabbit, said he, looking at the hobbit's furry feet. And he picked him up by the toes and shook him. Yes, lots, said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. No, none at all, not one, he said immediately afterwards. What do you mean, said Bert, holding him up by the hair this time. What I say, said Bilbo, gasping, and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and cook better than I look. If you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a beautiful, beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper. Poor little blighter, said William. He'd already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he'd had lots of beer. Poor little blighter, let him go. Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all, said Bert. I don't want to have me throat cut in me sleep. Hold his toes in the fire till he talks. I won't have it, said William. I caught him anyway. You're a fat fool, William, said Bert, as I've said afore this evening, and you're a lout. I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins, said Bert, and puts his fist in William's eye. There was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him to the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms, rolling nearly into the fire and thumping and kicking, while Tom whacked at both of them with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, only made them madder than more. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round. So there he lay for a while, panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight, up came Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately and, "A sack, Tom, quick!" they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion was, knew what was happening. A sack was over his head and he was down. "There's more to come," said Tom, or I'm mighty mistook. "Lots and none at all it is," said he. "No burrow hobbits, lots of these here dwarves, that's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert. "We'd best get out of the light." And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows. There's Balin coming up, trying to figure out what's happening. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the gnawed mutton, in surprise, pop went a nasty smelly sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Fili and Kili together, and Dorry and Norry and Orry all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Bifur and Boffer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom, for Bifur and Boffer and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarves will when cornered. Then Thorin came at last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside the shadows some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who's been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They'd forgotten all about him. "But hiding in bushes with sacks," said he. And I am going to stop there because it's almost 20 minutes. So I'll carry on reading tomorrow. We'll find out what happens to all the dwarves tied up in sacks. Can Thorin save them? Will Bilbo get eaten? We shall see. Oh yeah, where's Gandalf? Skulking around doing no good. Oh, I don't know what is he doing. What do you reckon? Talk to you tomorrow.